The trade spat between the U.S. and other nations is featuring at a key meeting in South Africa. Trade ministers from the BRICS group are discussing the tit-for-tat row and cooperation between member states. CGTN's Angelo Coppola is there and filed this report.
The 5 heads of delegation were unanimous in their rejection of the unilateralist stance taken by the US president. Recently, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development confirmed that global foreign direct investment flows had already shown a staggering 23% drop this year alone, and that's directly attributable to President Trump. The indirect impacts were also clearly visible. Just yesterday, the World Trade Organization reported a doubling in restrictive trade practices from some G20 countries in the first 6 months of this year. Meanwhile, the Assistant Minister for Commerce from China likened President Trump's behavior to that of a bull in a china shop. And South Africa's Trade Minister reiterated the negative impact, explaining that the steel and aluminium sector would see wholesale job losses, this after the US imposed increased tariffs, contrary to an AGOA agreement. It appears that the current global economic environment has brought the BRICS countries closer together, though, as seen in the signed declaration at the end of the meeting. It sees closer cooperation on intellectual property matters, on e-commerce, jointly developing smaller enterprises across the BRICS countries, and promoting trade on value-adding products amongst the 5 countries. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Magaliesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's get you more perspective on BRICS trade now. A little earlier, we spoke to Ken Gichinga. He's the chief economist at Mentoria Consulting. We began by asking him how important trade is between BRICS members.
To understand how global finance has evolved over the last 50 years. Back in 1948, we had the Bretton Woods institutions coming up, the IMF and the World Bank. And in a sense, they have dominated global finance for the last 70 years. The new thinking is there needs to be an alternative to what we call the Washington Consensus. And these are the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and really them coming together and deciding that they can raise enough capital for their own infrastructure needs. So it's really going against the grain of global finance, but it's really creating alternative avenues for nation states to tap into infrastructure financing that was never available to them before. Obviously, from the Trump presidency, we've seen a very unprecedented take on global trade, not just between US and China, but really how trade wars are created. People have come to realize that we are in a far more unpredictable world. What that means is that nation states right now are starting to depend on what we call the global south, or what we call developing states coming together to create avenues for themselves. So it's become very important. So in a sense, the spat between the US and China is only creating more opportunity for countries to explore other opportunities of financing and to wean off what we would have called the traditional sources of financing. A lot needs to happen. I think the biggest thing has to be on diplomatic relations. Just here in Africa, we saw the Continental Free Trade Agreement coming in. Not all the countries endorsed it. Nigeria did not endorse it. But what really has been on the minds of policymakers has been travel and trade between African countries has been not nearly as much as it can be. And this is the new opportunities that really can be created. Now, how do you improve that? Well, you have 2 types of barriers. You have trade barriers, you have tariff barriers, and you have non-tariff barriers. I think a lot of the work in the policy work has worked on the tariff barriers, really removing the policies that make trade difficult. But there's also a lot of non-tariff barriers that still have not been addressed. So issues around culture, the issues around history, issues around political economy, and I think these are the far more harder questions that we have to ask. If you look at intercontinental flights from a country like, maybe from a city like Nairobi to Lagos, it's possibly even more expensive than a similar flight from Nairobi out to London. So these are some of the structural challenges that really policymakers are trying to choose to change over the next few years.